where I'm going to use the Analog Discovery 2 board and try and show you a bit about some of the settings, in particular for Experiment 5 and Project 2. And I'm going to talk about single trace recording, which can matter on the Analog Discovery. There's a separate video for the M2K, and the M2K runs a bit different, so some of these details do not carry over. Most of them actually do. So with that, let me go ahead and share a screen with you. And hopefully that gray box will get smaller real quick. So if you look, I have here hovercam on a instrumented beam. It is the one that students in class can actually use. It's just a beam. Okay, there's the strain gauge for the online people, in case you're interested, since you don't have to do the strain gauge. I happen to have the accelerometer and the integrator on here, and this beam goes up and down, and you can see on digital waveforms, I mean, you can see it there. And if you're interested, sitting here, I also do have the other beams I was looking at. In particular, this one is a carpenter's square that can go up and down. This is I did a wood board one. There's a hunk of concrete down on the floor. You can see sitting there that I use as how I held it up on the table. So, and all this works with those two. Different frequencies, different levels, but the same approach with each of these. So it doesn't really matter which instrument I use, which beam I use. It's the same for all of them, and you have the same issues with all of them. With this, and I imagine my resolution is such that you can't see all the details, but if you go in and play with it some, you'll be able to do what you want to do, I believe. Some of the things I want to point out that it's a little hard to do other than just show you. There's a settings up here. And again, maybe you can't see it. It's a little gear symbol. You can change the background. Okay, and I can make it light. And I actually prefer the light to the dark. Okay. Now, just so you know, you can also, if I just right click anywhere in the unused space in here, I could also change it here. It's just here it forgets. And next time I turn it on, it's not going to remember what I said here, versus if I change it up in the settings up here, it remembers. Okay. There's another thing. If you look at these traces, there's always that bit of fuzz on them. And I think a lot of you have come to see this. And if I just stop, okay, there's another settings over here, which is actually somehow in my screen view, it is missing. Maybe I don't have the right version of waveforms. Interesting. So I'll just do it the harder way. If I go into channel 1, there's this noise issue that we don't want. There should be another settings right here where I can do it. Maybe I haven't updated waveforms on this particular computer. And if you look at the trace, it doesn't have that hash on it, which was a sort of a noise sensitivity type thing, which it doesn't seem to me like that should be the default. So I can turn it off there, and this I have to do each time. Turn it off there. And I think these traces, again, excuse me, are a little bit clearer. So those are little details of things that I like to do. Okay. Now, what I'm interested in is how do we look at these traces and things like that? So let me go ahead and let it run again. And you see, one of the things you notice, and again, my scales are such that I'm not sure why I have an offset here. Let's get rid of that. If I look at the channel 1, which is the output of the accelerometer, channel 2 is the output of the integrator. Read the accelerometer signal. It's sitting here about 1.8 some volts, and the accelerometer works 0 to 3 volts. And so if there's no gravity effect on it, it should be about 1.5. This is now sitting with gravity given in a Z acceleration. And so that gives about 0.4 some volts more. So I'm sitting at about 1.8, actually more like 1.9 volts. And that's just what it's going to sit at. And then as it accelerates, it goes up and down from there, right? Okay. So one of the things I can do to make this a little bit easier for me is I can intentionally add an offset. So minus 1.9 is what I want to use here. And now the traces are on top of each other. Okay. And I find that advantageous. You just got to remember that saturation is still going to occur at where it would. And so by adding that offset, I haven't changed my sensitivity or anything else. I haven't, it's just a mathematical addition of a DC voltage to do it. The other things I forgot to mention, I should mention real quick, to make this work, let me just mention, if I go to WaveGen, if you notice, WaveGen is sitting DC 3 volts. That is powering, and that's channel 1. That's powering the accelerometer. Accelerometer wants just 3 volts, does not want 5. That could be bad. So I have WaveGen DC doing that. If I go and look at supplies, they have to be on. +5, -5, enable. Okay. So all that, I can go back to the scope and concentrate on the scope. Okay. So I've done this, and what we have, of course, as you see, I do this, and of course, there's many, many traces that go on. So there are some things I can do in here to play with this. And one is to look up here at the trigger. So right now, the trigger is auto, channel 1, rising edge at 0 volts, but it's in this auto. Auto means that it's going to automatically sweep even if you don't, it doesn't actually hit a trigger level. Okay, so let me just turn this to normal. And if you look, it says armed. It's not actually triggering. It's waiting. And so it's waiting for channel 1 to have a positive edge crossing 0 volts, right? And I can get that, but I'm not getting it right now. So if I go back, let me actually back up. Go back to auto. So it'll always trace. None will always trace. Also, let me just take this away for a second. Put that back to 0. Okay, and now it's tracing. It's armed auto. It's tracing. Okay. Again, this is sitting about 1.9. If I do even a small pluck, you notice I'm going well above 2 volts. So I'm going to say, why don't I trigger on channel 1 when it crosses maybe like 2.2 volts? Okay, enter that. Now what happens is, again, on auto, it's still going to find a time to trigger if it can find something else. But if I now go to normal, normal says unless it crosses this condition, channel 1, rising edge, 2.2 volts, it will not trigger. Okay. So if I go ahead and do this, you see it triggers. It's going to keep triggering until the signal, in fact, I'm surprised it didn't give me another trigger. The signal at the end of this was probably just about 2.2, so it didn't have enough to re-trigger again, right? So this is nice. I can get a trace, and I can keep it, and I can, export this, and I can do math on it. I can put my minus, I think I'll have to do a re-trigger, but let me go back to the minus 1.9 here. Okay, I didn't do minus. It helps. Okay, I can get this down so they're sort of pretty much around the same 0, things like that. So there's things I can do with this. And again, I still have this trigger here. If I give it another pluck, it's going to trigger again. Okay, and it's going to, if I made this instead of 2.2, let's make it about 2.5, somewhere around there, so it's saturating. But make sure I actually get that into there. Okay, so now when channel 1 with all this noise crossed 2.5, it triggered. And by the time it got over here and tried to come around again, it didn't have enough signal to trigger again, right? So we can use the normal rising edge and pick a voltage. And again, I looked at the voltage without the DC offset to figure out what it was. And actually, it's still giving me the numbers here, so I can see that as to what it really was. And that's good. There's a problem with waveforms, and that now if I just say, well, I want to see more cycles. If I just say, make it 100 milliseconds per division, right? And actually, I guess 100 is going to work. Let me go ahead and try this. I'm going to give it another pluck. Okay, so 100 milliseconds per division. Okay. I think it's then at 200 milli. So if you can work at 100 milliseconds per division, you're set. If I go to 200, And watch, it's going to prove me a liar here. Isn't that interesting? I had trouble with this before, and now it seems to be behaving. Okay, so I did 200 milliseconds division. I see more traces. Life is good. I'm not quite sure why the issues I saw before do not seem to show up. Let me try 500 milliseconds division, and it's all working right now, so I will not worry about some of this. I will show you a single trigger anyway. Okay. So let me go back, and I kind of like this 200 milliseconds division. But what I don't like is the fact that I'm wasting half the screen over here on the left, right? So that's where the position and time come into play. And some of you have played with this already. That what happens is the analog discovery and the M2K does the same thing. It's always recording data, but it's always overwriting that until you get a trigger. My trigger is occurring right here when this trace crossed 2.5 volts. 2.5, it crossed right there. Okay. And so then it triggers. And so it keeps this data here and then it records new data, right? We don't need all this here. So we can change this, and you can drag this thing. Okay, now I dragged it. It doesn't look good. Let me go ahead. It's all armed, ready to go. Let me give it another pluck. So you notice now zeros here, and I get more cycles, and I like this. The thing I will ask that if you drag this and you got some sort of funky time here, I ask that you go up. It's easier for us if you pick a nice number, and so I'm going to use 500 milliseconds. I think it'll take that. Let's see what happens when I try that. Yeah, okay. That's a nice number. I can do calculations based on that. And again, if I give it another pluck, you can see there it is. There's my trace. Again, the orange is the accelerometer. The blue is the integration of the accelerometer. And I got plenty of cycles to play with. And this is you could decide how you'd like to do this. I sort of went with 500 because if I didn't chose to put this at 100 milliseconds, now it's all the way on the left edge. Sometimes I like to see the trace before the trigger. I just did another pluck, and you can see I get a trace here. Okay. So I can do all that. Now, let me go back to 200. And it is all behaving right now. If it didn't behave, the option I have is to go to this single trace. See, right now it says it's armed. I'm on normal, I'm armed, and it's not triggering. If it's triggering on you, and that could be just be due to some noise or something like that, or let me actually do this. Let me say, what if I trigger at about 2.2? Okay. If I trigger here and I do a pluck, and that behaved, I could have actually got another trace run. You see the trace over here is pretty close to 2.2. So it would have been possible for it to give me yet another trace that would just wipe over this one. Let me do a really big pluck. Yeah, see that happened there? That because I did a really big pluck, that the signal was still big enough that it ran again. Now, this might actually be the nicest traces to use, if you want that. But we have the option of also is saying, I want to choose a single trace. So if I hit single, see it says armed here. And what happens, I give it a pluck. I'll give it a big one again. Lots of distortion and stuff like that. A big one, but see, it says done. It will not trigger again. Okay, so lots of distortion going on in here. I give it another pluck, and it's not going to trigger again until I say single again. Okay, and then it's waiting for something to cross. And there it is. And again, if I just keep plucking away, it's not going to trigger again. So single trace can be useful. Okay. I'm going to go back to run because this is actually working pretty well without the single trace. But again, you can't, if I ran just auto here, okay, auto, it's going to re-trigger at some point no matter what I do. So I can get a nice pluck, and there it is, but then it's going to re-trigger. Okay, so what I want when I'm doing these plucks is I want to go to normal. I want to pick channel 1 or channel 2, a rising or a falling edge, and a level, and go through all that. Okay. And that would allow me, so I'm back to that now, and if I do a pluck, I can get a signal out of it. Okay, now with all that, trying to think of what else. The other thing I can say is clearly you see the saturation, and this is the limit of the accelerometer. These right here. It's not a saturation of the input of the analog discovery. It's the accelerometer. So on this beam and on your beam, I really need to make my flux pretty minus, and that's probably still too much. Okay. Now, the fact that gravity is giving it a signal that's above 1.5, it saturates easier on the positive side than on the negative. Okay. And if you notice, the integration actually sees that the more area down here than up here, remember the integration has a minus sign in front of it. So the whole blue trace starts shifting up. And eventually out here, it's starting to equal out. Okay. So that distortion affects your measure of velocity too, because you're trying to integrate the area into this curve and the curve is wrong. You also notice higher harmonics. That can be due to a whole bunch of things. If my plate here wobbles at all, it'll do that, but I have my plate pretty good. If my board wobbles, and I think that's actually part of what's going on, my board is able to wobble like that, so I can try and play games with that. But it doesn't matter to some extent. If I have some wobble in the board at the higher frequencies, that's fine. And let me just try and do a small pluck there. That's still too big. Yep. So when I mean small, I actually need it really small. So something like that is a much more useful trace. And you notice right now, I still have, the thing is ready to run, but as long as the input signal doesn't cross 2.2 volts, which, is somewhere right about up here, it's not going to retrace. I can export this. I can do amplitudes. I can do, frequency on this. Okay. So just some statements on using the waveforms and the analog discovery 2. And I hope this helps you a little bit for experiment 5 and project 2, whether you're doing the online or the hybrid version. And with that, I will stop recording.